One thing that's true for all moms, we have a lot of stories to tell. Some are silly, some are gross, some bring us to tears. With each story that's shared, another mom feels a little less alone. So join us as we laugh, learn, and grow together. It's the iMom Podcast. Welcome to this week's episode of the iMom Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Abby. Susan and Chloe and Megan are here again. Every family faces some big changes at some point or another. Maybe you move, someone gets sick, someone's lost a job, or you've heard us mention several times in Susan and Megan's family, they chose adoption. Megan, this is when we tell you you're adopted. We decided to.
We said no, like that's, it's kind of funny, but it's not funny because so four of us have lighter hair, like blondish. My one sister's the only one with really dark hair. And when we were younger, we used to tell her she was adopted.
That's so you're not adopted. I've seen you look just like your dad.
I get both. Sometimes I get my dad. Sometimes I get my mom. I get a lot. You're a blonde Susan.
I could see that. I see that for sure. Okay. The way you respond to the changes can bring your family closer together and strengthen your family identity. So in this episode, Susan's going to share their family's adoption story. And we're going to also talk about how your family can grow in the face of adjusting to one of these big changes. So Susan, I know it's a big story.
It's a big story. But in this case, we're really talking about making big decisions for your family can be scary. And they can cause disruption for your children. And none of us wants to do that. And sometimes we're afraid about it. But I think we cannot be paralyzed to go into the unknown. And it can be an amazing journey for every person in your family that can be painful, but also can strengthen and give them a kind of grit and determination for future challenges that God has for them. So I always wanted to adopt. That seed was planted when I was a camp counselor for an underprivileged camp, and just wanted to bring every child home with me. I got married. We had 3 kids. I was told I couldn't have any more. That really didn't have anything to do with it, except that my husband said we're done because he was not open to adoption. Now, in the meantime, my sister could not have children and ended up adopting through a friend of ours. My sister then started praying for me because she knew I wanted to adopt. And we used to always pray, well, I'm just going to pray with, we do family first. Somebody's going to drop a child into our lap. And Mark won't be able to resist that temptation. And my sister called one day and she said, hey, First Baptist Church, isn't that like, can't you see that from your lap? Where are you sitting right now in the living room? And I said, yeah. And she said, oh, there's a whole camp of kids coming to that church from Russia, and they're looking for host families who are interested in adoption. And I said, oh, yeah? Well, then, Mark, can we host a family? He goes, you can host all you want. We are not adopting. So we signed up. And we signed up for a little boy, and I thought that would just help open the door more because I had 2 girls and a boy, and maybe Mark would be more open to a boy. And that boy was at the last minute not allowed to leave the country, and I was bummed. And I thought, oh, this is the Lord closing the door. But the camp was right up the street at summer, and I said, girls, we're going to go volunteer. So we went to volunteer. And the way the camp worked is the kids came to camp, and it was an educational experience for them. They were older kids from Russia, and their host families, if they worked, could just drop them off at camp. So we volunteered. And so we kept getting assigned these 2 little girls whose parents were working. And it was great because my girls each had a little girl. And we, of course, fell in love with these little girls. And it didn't take very long before we were begging Mark, can we adopt them? Oh. And he was like, no, we kept going, oh, please, please. He agreed to, at the end of the camp to go to the big camp dinner. And he met them, and the little one in particular loved him, kept leaving her host family to come sit on his lap. Oh. And he came home and he goes, okay, tell the camp director, if they don't get adopted, we'll take them. And I thought, this is the Lord opening the door. Here we go. 2 girls. Oh my gosh, 4 girls. This is really the Lord, because we would have 2 girls plus 2 girls and poor Marky. But guess what? The host family hosting them decided to adopt them. And I thought, oh, I was so crushed, door closed. But Mark allowed me to sign up for the next camp. And he said, you're right, we might as well do 2, because to just have 1 out of, 3 adopted. So I'm like, whoa, we are, way to go, God. And so we signed up for 2 kids, and
to be a host family too.
To be a host family for the camp that was happening at Christmas. And Christmas came, and I got the email of the 2 kids, and I opened it up and said, oh, a girl and a boy, aren't they? Yeah, this is awesome. And then I read their ages. So I was home alone. Mark wasn't there. And the girl was 2 weeks older than Emily, and the boy was 8 months younger than Marky. And I thought, oh, no. Birth order. You read all this stuff and, oh my gosh, they were from Siberia, Russia. How could they, to have 2 girls the same age about to turn 13? No way. Wow. I was like, okay, I just felt sick. And I immediately emailed back, didn't even wait for Mark to come home. We really need kids younger. Like the other 2 were in the last camp. They were 5 and 6. Marky at the time was 8. That's perfect. And Marky's my youngest. Well, Mark came home that night and I said, I got the email, but just so you know, they're wrong ages. And he goes, what do you mean? He goes, we at least need to meet them. Mm-hmm. And I was so convicted. I just thought, okay, here's my husband who doesn't want to adopt and he's willing. So I emailed her back and I said, we're willing. Okay, we'll host him. The camp was delayed in Moscow. So let me just tell you how pathetic these poor, sweet kids are. They only come with the clothes that they're wearing. So they had been delayed 3 days in Moscow. So by the time they get to us and we pick them up at the airport, it's nighttime. They're exhausted. They're scared. Of course, we've bought all these clothes for them. It was so pitiful. Hannah, her name was Yulia, was Emily's 2 weeks older than Emily. They're almost 13 at this point. Emily was wearing, like adult clothes size. We had bought Hannah size 10 clothes because she looked small. She was a 6X. Oh, so wow. 60 pounds, 12 years old.
Oh my gosh.
Grant was even smaller. Of course, he was younger. He is sick. He has bronchitis. I mean, it was pathetic. They're just exhausted. They smell. Their clothes are filthy. Like I literally bathed them and burned their clothes. Not, I didn't really, but they went out in the garbage can, not even in my kitchen garbage. So the next morning I had arranged to take them to my tailor who's from Russia because we can't communicate with them. And I just wanted to know the scoop on them because I'm trying to map out in my head, can we do this? Okay, God, this is a lot. So I wake up the next morning early. And again, it's right after Christmas. So my sister's out in the guest house because she had wanted to meet them. So they had stayed after Christmas. So I have 11 people in my home and her whole family, my whole family, these kids. And I wake up and nobody is awake. And I'm like, oh, yes, because I have got to have a come to Jesus moment with the Lord. So I went downstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and I literally just, because I am guilt up to my neck. Like if we can't do this, what's going to become with these kids? She's 12 at 16. She's on the streets. She'll become a prostitute, blah, blah, blah. And I'm feeling like we can't do this. It's not going to work. They're the wrong age. And yet on the other hand, if we don't, how am I going to live with the guilt? And I let the Bible fall open and it fell open to Hebrews 11. And I began to read, by faith, Abraham did this, by faith, Isaac did this, by faith, Jacob did this, by faith, by faith, by faith. And all of these saints, it was credited righteousness, blah, 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 blah. And, I will say there have been times in my life where I really feel like God put me in the bubble and peace came upon me. And that was one of the moments I felt like God was telling me, whether you can do it or not, I'm going to show you if you can do it or not. And if I decide you can't do it, you're just going to have to trust that these kids are going to be okay without you. And this is for every mom. We have to be okay that one day our kids are going to be okay without us. And I took them to Tatiana, and this was before she opened. So we got there before 8:00 so that she could have time to talk to them. And she's talking to these kids and their face just lights up. A, because she's adorable. B, because she's speaking Russian and they are just lost and scared. And she gets them talking and I'm watching the clock thinking her customers are, and she's so busy, are going to be pouring in. And I go, okay, Tatiana, enough. Who's their parents? Why were they in an orphanage? Give me the scoop on their life story. And she goes, okay. And she asks questions and all of a sudden I hear one of them say America and one say Florida. And then she goes, oh. And she takes a piece of paper and she starts writing down these names and ages. And I'm like, okay, what? She goes, Susan. There's 5 of them. And I'm like, okay, closing the door again, God, here we go. You're showing me because there's no way we can afford to adopt 5 kids. That would be over the top. And I go, that's impossible though. Russia did not at the time separate children. And I go, well, how did that happen? She goes, Susan. There's Yulia. She goes, they have different fathers and they got separated. She goes, there's Yulia, 12, Yura, 8, Lida, 7, Veronica, 6, and there's a baby who's 2. And I go, Lida and Veronica. I go, and she goes, oh, and Susan, he thinks these 2, and she points to the middle 2, are in America and she thinks they're in Florida. And I go, Florida, America, Lita and Veronica. And I said, did one have blonde hair and one red hair? And she looked at me weird and she asked them in Russian and they go, yes, yes. And my heart just sank because the two we fell in love with in the first camp were the two that are related to the two we had. Wow. And at that time, that host family was already in Russia with completing the adoption to bring them back.
Wow.
So I called the orphanage. I said, the camp, do you have pictures of Lydia and Veronica? I think they have their siblings. And she goes, that's impossible. They don't separate siblings. They have different last names. It's not impossible. They were. And that was God's, just affirmation for me. I'm going to cry. Sometimes God gives us what we need to make these tough decisions for our families, because I knew having two streetwise kids who grew up in the wilderness of Siberia, the same age of two of my kids, was going to seriously rock the boat. And this is not what I had wanted. I wanted littles, I wanted that birth order. But it was clear to me that God had brought these kids out because their siblings were coming out. And, Siberia, I talked to my pastor at length about this. Like, how could this happen? What are the chances that they would be taken from two different orphanages? Nobody knew that they were coming and they'd all be chosen to come to this tiny little camp in Tampa, Florida. And he said, Siberia is where they exiled all the Christians. Stalin exiled the Christians. And he said, the other two kids, the two we had fallen in love with, were adopted by an Orthodox Jewish family. And here your two kids are being adopted by a Christian family. And he said, don't you just know somewhere in those kids' past was a faithful believer. And God is calling these kids out of just this poverty and difficult situation they're in, because it was bad. We went to Kansk and had to spend a month there to adopt the kids because he wants to honor those Christians in their past. And just to complete the story, the fifth child was adopted by another family who lived across from the street from Lydia and Veronica's parents because I shared video of the other child.
So how far
them.
did they live from you guys?
1 mile.
That's wild.
Wow.
Yeah. So all 5 kids have, in fact, we just went to the wedding of Lita, who is marrying a boy, Aviv, from Israel. And it's just it's a
Wow.
crazy story.
Yeah.
We shared Yom Kippur with them. We went to their bat mitzvahs. They've come over.
What was it like for the siblings to hang out?
Oh, it's fascinating because when they get together, especially Grant, Lita, and Veronica have the same mommy and dad. So they really lived together for 6 or 7 years. When they talk about their childhood, living in Siberia, no heat, playing with mice for toys, treasuring the lady who, in the village who gave them a loaf of bread. Like so my point is, for my biological kids, and Megan, you can pipe in here, this was really hard. There was a lot of chaos that came with the adoption because they were very hurt kids. But it also was a great growth experience for my American privileged kids, which all kids in America are privileged, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. Megan, what were you thinking? I mean, this episode is about, when you make a big change or when a big change happens to your family, for you kids, you didn't really get much of a say in it. How were you feeling throughout all of it?
I was in, 7th grade, Susan?
I think you were in 8th, maybe 7th at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember. Anywho, so I was old enough to understand. However, now being a parent, looking back, I'm like, that is insane. Insanity. Absolutely, crazy. But at the time, I did get a lot of comments from friends like, well, what do you mean you have 2 new siblings, a new brother and a sister? What is that? Because it was kind of out of the norm, I think, for the group that we grew up in. I don't even know if we knew anyone that had adopted it. I feel like it was much less commonplace than maybe today. I don't know, maybe not. But so at the time I knew something was up and I knew it wasn't totally normal, but I was there for the conversation when we found out that they were the siblings of our neighbors' kids. And I understood enough to know that doesn't happen by chance. It's not like, it's just not like a coincidence. So I felt fine with it, but I also probably wasn't impacted as much as my two biological brother and sister because they were much closer in their age and whatnot. There were definitely some scary moments that, as a kid make you feel unstable. Like kids really, crave that stability. And we had always had so much stability. Like there was never a time where I felt unsafe or unstable. And so to go through that instability in your family and see your siblings who you've grown up with your whole life kind of struggle with these two new siblings, it's a little bit hard to kind of mentally come to terms with. But I think because our parents had provided us with such a stable environment and we trusted them so much that like we knew it was the right thing to do. And like I said, we knew that God had brought them to us and that it wasn't just by chance. But at the same time, like there's still things today that I think, we struggle with as a family because we're really close, that we have to work through because we're all very different and we come from different backgrounds and whatnot. But at the same time, like I remember it was so hard for us to send them back because they came to stay with us for 2 weeks for that trial period. And then they had to go back. Oh. And it was so hard to say goodbye to them. And like we worried about them and we were excited for them to come back. And then I think Susan left this part out of the story, but when they were over there, they had to go for, I think, a couple of weeks, but then a civil war broke out and they got stuck there for like
in
a
Russia.
month.
Wow.
And in Russia. And that really freaked me out because then I was like, a war broke out where they are in this foreign country that I don't know what kind of like, military, like, I don't know what's going on. And, so that really scared me because I was like, are my parents never going to come back? And we were having like different people watch us. We were having like my godparents and grandparents and friends. And so it felt like an eternity to me as a little kid when your parents are gone for like a month. But at the same time, it all worked out as it should have been. And I loved growing up in a big family. It taught me a lot about building relationships with different personalities and working through struggles and issues. And I think the biggest thing it taught me was how fortunate I was to not only grow up in the United States, but grow up in a family where I've never had to worry about if I'm going to have a next meal. Yeah. Because they did not have that. I've never had to worry about being safe or are my parents going to come home or whatever it might be. And I know people struggle with that here. But I think if you travel to any other country or a third world country or anything like that, it's unreal how some people have to live. And it just made me super grateful for the childhood that I did have and that I got to have a childhood. They did not have childhoods. Mm-hmm. They had to be adults from like as long as they can remember because they didn't have that. So, it taught me a ton of things. And I think, someday I would potentially love to adopt. We'd have to talk through that. But I just think there's so many kids that need really good parents. And I definitely think it's something you have to be called to, but I think you're not only being a gift to that child, but that child is a gift to you.
Yeah. So sometimes you don't get a say in the change, kind of like what we're talking about with Megan and being a child in the family that was adopting. What about the times that these things are happening in your family? So your husband gets transferred, someone gets sick. How do you embrace that change and have faith through those changes when you're not the one who's getting to decide them? And I know, Megan, you have experience with this with your husband. How'd you make that work?
Yes. So my husband and I dated long distance, our whole dating relationship. And then we got married and then he had to deploy for almost a year. So it was funny. I always tell people we had never lived in the same state or city or anything until a year after we got married, which was a big adjustment. But he has been very thoughtful in that he feels called to things and he does not doubt them, which is something I love about him. And he's actually done 2 deployments. The first one, like I said, was a year after we got married, or it was for a year after we got married. And then he deployed when we had our first for 4 months. So he missed him being a baby from when he was like 4 to 8 months, I think, or something like that. And then we've moved a bunch for different jobs for him and things like that. But like I said, when he feels called to do something, he really doesn't question it. pregnant. And I feel like I trust him in that. And, I also felt like it was time for us to go or do or whatever. But so that gave me a little bit of a peace. It was less of a struggle for me to go and do those things when we felt called to do it. However, it doesn't mean it was easy. It was definitely hard. I mean, we moved like 7 times within our first like 3 years of marriage or something like that. And that just creates a lot of stress and chaos. And we were starting over and finding new friends, and you're just learning everything, where the closest post office is, where you're going to live, how are you going to get there? Can you have a car in the city that you're moving to? Because like we moved into DC and there wasn't even space to have a car. So it did create a lot of stress, but I think I knew that we were in it together and that we were called to do it. And so that gave me a peace about it. But again, there were definitely tough seasons. I think the roughest season ever was when we first moved to DC, and we lived in DC, and I found out I was pregnant, and I had no family, no friends. I knew no one. And it was just brutal, especially being an extrovert. Yeah. And then COVID hit right smacked. And then it was like even more of being locked down because I couldn't even travel or do anything or go anywhere. So that was a tough season. But, I think one of the things I've recognized is it's a season and it'll pass and you'll get through it, and you have each other, hopefully, or you have, hopefully people in your life that you can rely on. And you just have to pray and know that you'll make it through it and it'll pass.
I think that kind of is what I was going to say, is it's an opportunity to model faithfulness and strength to your kids when your family is put in a situation where a big change happens or something appends the family. I have a friend whose daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. I think she was like maybe 9 or 10 when it happened. And through a turn of events, I mean, this was back in like 2018, 19. The little girl's fine. But there was a point in her treatment where they didn't have the drug available to her. And my friend was like, well, what does this mean? And the doctor's like, well, then we can't give her this medication. And she's like, okay, so is she going to live if she doesn't have this medication? And they said, well, she's better off with it. And my friend said, well, then we need to find this medication. And she literally went on Facebook and was like, which is so bizarre to me because I was like, you can do this. She went on Facebook and she asked everybody, she's like, hey, call hospitals in your area and see if they have Erwinaze. And a bunch of people did. There were spreadsheets going of like multiple hospitals in multiple states of people looking for this drug. They ended up finding her the drug. And now, years later, my friend has started a nonprofit organization. She has testified before Congress. She's been recognized by CNN. She was invited to a roundtable at the White House because she started this organization to help end drug shortages for kids. And it's like, if her family had not been through that, then, I mean, she has saved children's lives by the work that she's doing. And I'm like, wow, what an opportunity that this change that they did not ask for has brought. And Abby, the little girl, she's going to be a freshman in high school next year. So yeah.
That's amazing.
I think that this has been just a really great conversation. And there's so much more to this about how to listen to the Lord, how to handle hard things when they come to your family. And so I think we're going to do like a part 2 to this one. So make sure you come back for the next episode and we're just going to have a deeper conversation. But thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the iMom podcast. iMom is the motherhood program of the nonprofit organization Family First. Along with our fatherhood program, All Pro Dad, we exist to help you love your family well. Subscribe to our daily email, the iMom Minute, by going to imom.com/subscribe and get tons of great ideas, insight, and inspiration. The iMom podcast is hosted by me, Abby Watts, along with Susan Merrill, Megan Tigner, and Chloe Blumenthal.